Well, in back-to-back weeks, it's going to be a Mountain West team taking on UCLA. This week, it's New Mexico going on the road, taking on UCLA, 8 p.m. Mountain Time on the Big Ten Network. UCLA coming off that tough defeat against UNLV on the road last week. It looked like it was going to be a blowout, 23-3 at halftime. UCLA finds a way to crawl their way back, makes it a competitive game, and really one interception in the red zone away from tying the game up, and who knows what would happen in overtime. New Mexico coming off their first win of the season at home against Idaho State. Jason Eck's first win of the New Mexico era. The Lobos looked, sloppy at times. They looked great at times. Similar to UNLV, Idaho State definitely gave them, a tough game throughout. New Mexico looked to be on the verge of really blowing them out in the first half, and they let Idaho State stick around. UNM gets a turnover, and they go into halftime 14-13, and they stay on the Lobos' heels throughout. Lobos were able to pull away, late in the fourth quarter, but a great win for Eck to start his Lobos tenure, and from here they take on UCLA on the road. Despite 0-2 record for the Bruins, tough team that New Mexico has ahead of them. It's a primetime game on a Friday matchup. UCLA opens up at 15.5 point favorites. The over-under on this game is 52.5. I'd be hesitant to say New Mexico can't be in any game this season. They feel like a team that really plays to their competition, and seeing what UNLV was able to do last week, seeing how the Lobos fared against Idaho State, a team that UNLV also faced in week 0. Anything's possible. I mean, this Lobo team feels like they can win in a multitude of ways, but throw the stats out the window, and this team's gonna find a way to stay competitive any way they can, whether it's throwing the ball, relying on Scott Trey Humphrey or DJ McKinney. UCLA struggled so far with Nico at quarterback. He did look good in the final stretches of last week's game, able to bring them back into it. The Bruins, it feels like both UCLA and New Mexico are still filling it out. They don't know what's going to work best for them. The Bruins don't really have any running game. Meanwhile, the Lobos, passing is not their strong suit. They can make some crucial catches when needed to keep the drive going. They're going to rely on the running game, and I think Humphrey and guys like McKinney and Bankston are going to be their workhorses this weekend. Try and be physical at the line. Last week, their line, had a tough time. This Lobos line could be questionable at the moment. Same could be said about UCLA. Defensively, New Mexico has holes in their secondary and their linebackers. It seemed like Idaho State was able to get these cross routes at will and keep momentum going and really drive downfield 5-8 yards at a time. And also, Lobos have struggled with a running quarterback, and last weekend was no exception. How will Nico fare against a spotty defense in the Lobos right now? If he sees it's wide open in the middle of the field, he's gonna break for it, and he could really tear New Mexico apart with that. As far as the passing goes, despite Nico throwing 2 picks, he could definitely be better. Certainly, you look at Jack Lane's picks; they came at inopportune times, but still, definitely not saying much. I think they're going to be both encouraged to throw it when they can if they see openings. This is a game that feels like who has more to prove right now. Lobos are riding high off their first win of the season. UCLA down 0-2, a tough game against UNLV last week and got absolutely destroyed by Utah the week before. And now the Bruins are really, grasping at straws to see, they really need a decisive victory against this New Mexico team that's still very much rebuilding and figuring out what works for them. Sure, UCLA has, the top recruits and the better facilities and all that, but right now, New Mexico is not a team to sleep on, and I wouldn't be surprised if, they give the Bruins a run for their money and keep it competitive throughout. I think the Lobos are going to play their best football no matter who they're against, and despite being outmatched in skill and top recruits, they're just going to give their best effort. And I could see X team giving UCLA trouble early on, and it's not crazy to say that they stick with them throughout and really give the Bruins their best effort. Both teams have given up a lot of points against their opponents this first 2 weeks, but in the Lobos case, they've managed to score and drive it downfield, and I feel like turnovers and mistakes have been their issue. Same could be said about UCLA, but UCLA's really had a tough time getting on their opponent's side of the 50 and executing from there. I'm not going to go on the verge of saying that New Mexico's upsetting UCLA, but I think that UCLA is going to find that New Mexico could give them trouble and very well likely give them a scare during this game a couple of times and really being relentless all night. And it's a good matchup. Both teams. One team needs a win real bad. The other team's looking just to keep momentum going into their conference play and their rivalry matchup in a couple weeks. It's New Mexico, UCLA, 8 p.m. Mountain Time on the Big Ten Network. Be sure to check this one out.